Now back to this story. The 68th Annual Commission on the Status of Women, the UN's largest annual gathering on gender equality and women's empowerment, is wrapping up tonight. This gathering of women from around the globe aims to end violence against women and enhance their empowerment through financial stability. Now we've established that line again with Neela Ghoshal, who's the Senior Director for Policy Law and Research at Outright International. Neela, thank you so much for coming back to us. I was saying that, there are strides that have been made when it comes to women emancipation, but centuries later, we are nowhere near where we'd like to be ideally when it comes to equality and gender equality specifically. Now, what were some of the key challenges that came out of this conference?
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much. As you've mentioned, we are on a trajectory in which things are improving for women in all their diversity around the world and for girls. And yet, if we continue going at the same pace in terms of women's equal access to education, employment, and a life free of violence, it will be centuries before we achieve gender equality. And so something needs to happen to speed up that pace of development. So at the Commission on the Status of Women, what happens is that all 193 UN member states get together and they sit down and debate over what kinds of steps need to be taken by states to improve the status of women around the world. And non-governmental organizations like my organization, Outright International, are on the sidelines of the conference, seeking to influence states in terms of the types of priorities that they bring to the negotiating table and the types of issues that they address. My organization focuses specifically on the human rights and inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer people. And so one of the messages that we bring to the Commission on the Status of Women is that all women and girls need to move forward together, and as long as any are left behind for any reason, including their sexual orientation and gender identity or their sex characteristics, it won't be possible to fully make progress on ending discrimination and violence against women and girls. And so a couple of the messages that we've been bringing into the space is that the types of violence and harassment and discrimination that face women across the board. Cisgender women, trans women, lesbian women, heterosexual women, all women are dealing with gender-based violence. We're all dealing with ongoing lack of access to equal opportunities in the workplace. We're all dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace that prevents women from succeeding. And we're all dealing with unequal opportunities to achieve in education. And so our message to the Commission on the Status of Women was leave no one behind, including lesbian, bisexual, trans, and intersex women.
And speaking of that as well, gender-based violence is a big problem in many countries and also scary high levels here in South Africa. Now, it seems that no matter what is done, these numbers don't seem to be on the decrease, but seem to be on the rise. And then not only including, of course, cisgender women or straight women as well, it also then would include lesbian women, trans women too. So when it comes to gender-based violence, how can the UN then ensure that its member states take this as a serious priority? Because it's one thing talking about it, it's another thing making sure that this actually happens on the ground.
That's right. And one thing that I think the UN needs to do is address the root causes of gender-based violence. So we need to understand that gender-based violence doesn't exist simply because there are men in the world and there are women in the world, and it's something that simply happens or something that happens to women because of their anatomy. So as we know, it does affect all kinds of women, trans women, cis women, straight women, lesbian women, and it affects women in all their diversity, and it affects men, including in particular queer men, because of gendered power structures. And because there are people in the world who benefit tremendously from the patriarchy and from enforcing structures according to which women are expected to maintain certain roles, have certain obligations in society, and to behave in a certain way. And if women don't behave in those ways, we are punished for being ourselves, for behaving in the way that we do. And so looking at the ways in which gender-based violence affects LGBTIQ people, for instance, actually helps states to understand that gender-based violence is not just about the existence of different sexes, for instance, and one sex exerting power over another. It's about culture. It's about gender roles and gender norms. And we need to deeply interrogate the idea that men are born into society with a certain set of roles and women are born into society with a certain set of roles. And so part of our thinking around gender-based violence is we often use the word queering as a verb. We need to queer the conversations about gender-based violence and recognize the ways in which this violence is impacting diverse communities. And if we do that, that helps benefit all communities. So states need to fully invest, not just in, for instance, the punishment of gender-based violence. That's one thing. But when you address the punishment, you don't address the underlying root causes. You need to start in the education system. You need to start in families. And children need to understand that there are people of diverse genders, diverse sexualities who exist in the world, and that everybody has the right to fulfill their own development in their own way. These messages aren't yet reaching children. Children aren't getting access to comprehensive sexuality education around the world. Children aren't experiencing educational environments in which they are free from bullying, including based on their gender, their sexual orientation, and gender identity. And so a lot of these steps need to start happening much, much earlier.
You know, you're speaking of the slow pace that we are going at, and if we had to keep at this, it will take centuries before we get to an ideal spot. When we talk about gendered power structures, how far would you say we are from dismantling them or reconfiguring them in some way?
Well, we're making some progress, and we are still quite a bit from reaching full progress. When it comes to things like sexual orientation and gender identity, which are really at the heart of these gendered power structures, because these are the power structures through which states assert that people have these certain roles that they must follow. We've seen, for instance, a fairly dramatic decrease in the number of countries that criminalize sexual orientation and gender identity. And this is critical because as long as you criminalize a group of people because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, you make it possible for others to enact violence against them with complete impunity. So, for instance, about 10 years ago, there were around 76 countries that criminalized same-sex intimacy, and now the number has gone down to about 62 countries, meaning that we're making pretty remarkable progress, but it's not going fast enough. And so until all countries decriminalize same-sex conduct and make it possible for trans people to legally exist and live their lives, we won't be able to reach that full progress on ending gender-based violence. Another important number to throw out there is that in about 20 countries now, it's possible for trans people to change the gender marker on their documents to reflect their own deeply felt gender identity. Why is this important? As long as a trans person carries around an identity card that says that they are a man, but they look like a woman, or vice versa, they're exposed to violence anytime that their ID is interrogated and their identity is interrogated. And this happens in interactions with the police, but it also happens in day-to-day interactions at the bank, at the supermarket, when trying to rent an apartment or applying for a job. If your identity card doesn't match your gender expression, you face discrimination and you possibly face extreme violence as well. And so we've gone in the past 20 years from only about one state recognizing trans people's identities to about 20 states recognizing trans people's identities. So the progress is happening, but it's slow and it's not enough. And we're in a moment of extreme pushback right now. So we have a number of states saying that even the concept of gender is a threat to the so-called traditional family. So they don't want us to talk about gender. They want us to talk about sex. And they want to enforce the idea that there is a sort of biological determinism in life in which, as I mentioned, men have certain roles and women have certain roles. And these states are coming to the negotiating table and saying this language about gender is too much. It's advancing a dangerous gender ideology that's harmful to children or that's harmful to women. And they are not recognizing the ways in which talking about gender as a social construct and recognizing that every human being has or should have the opportunity to be themselves, that is the logic that has done a huge amount for women in the last century or so, right? Women have benefited greatly from the idea that gender is a social construct and we all have the right to determine our own destiny. But there are states that want to push us back really into the Stone Age where men have roles, women have roles, and we can't talk about diverse possibilities for humanity. And that's one of the root causes of violence, I think, that states really need to address.
And speaking of, states that take it back to stone ages as well, one can't help but think, there's some states where 2 steps are taken forward and then 10 steps taken back. When I think of Gambia, for instance, and the genital mutilation controversy that's unfolding there right now, and of course we can look at Uganda that's banning gay relationships as well. Clearly, these are regressive moves.
Exactly. So there's a number of countries in Africa that are proposing laws that criminalize or recriminalize or further criminalize same-sex conduct as well as identity. Ghana's proposed law, for instance, that was recently passed by Parliament and is awaiting signature by the President, prohibits simply being lesbian, gay, transgender, and the bill refers to any other gender identity that is contrary to the binary of male and female, again suggesting that there is some kind of innate male-female binary and nobody can deviate against it. If they are, by their essence, they're criminal. As you mentioned, this is related to laws like the proposed law in Gambia that would step back the progress that has been made on female genital mutilation. And this is really disturbing because, we had thought we'd made sort of progress toward recognizing that mutilating women's genitals was unacceptable. A related issue to that as well is the issue of genital mutilation of intersex children. This is one of these areas that is not talked about. And when we were at the Commission on the Status of Women just now, we were with a number of intersex activists who were bringing up the issue of involuntary forced surgeries on intersex children who have genitals or sex characteristics that don't neatly fit into the male-female binary. And there are many places around the world in which intersex children forcibly have their genitals mutilated by medical professionals to make them look more like a typical female or male. And so this is another form of violence that's not talked about much, but that we've been trying to bring up in spaces like the Commission on the Status of Women. But even as we do so, as you've said, there's countries where we're experiencing this extreme pushback. Russia, for instance, last year criminalized what it called the international LGBT social movement. There is no singular LGBT social movement. There's a lot of different organizations advocating for a lot of different things together with our partners in the feminist movement, in the human rights movement. And so countries like Russia are trying to silence all of us and saying to us, don't talk about gender, don't talk about human rights, don't talk about women's rights. And so it's really essential that we stand in solidarity with one another, that feminist activists stand in solidarity with LGBTIQ activists, that stand in solidarity with traditional human rights activists, and understand that we're all pushing for the same thing, which is gender equality, gender liberation, and the ability for every single human being who exists to thrive and to live a life of fulfillment and human dignity. But unfortunately, there's many forces out there who do not want this to happen.
Well, Neela, while the work has been making some progress, you do still have a lot of work cut out for you. So good luck to you and your organization as well. And thank you for joining us this evening.